Yes, it was a very generous introduction, and because we had the problem how to explain data space to architect. And in my presentation, I will try indeed to start from the very basic, from very historical case studies. Some of them are like actually first attempt to map in a digital way without computer the urban grid of New York and Manhattan by the New York Police Department. And from that, we will try to grow up to somehow to take off in terms of abstraction and entering some more abstract space of database and topology of data. But the beginning, of course, of computation, the computation of body started also at the time of enslavement and the third passage age. But in general, the idea is also that how to explain this. One of what I will try to do in my presentation is to show that indeed one of the best and most important metaphor epistemic models that are used to browse the complexity of database and data center today is a spatial metaphor. And the comparison I propose is the one with actually the introduction of a modern perspective during the Renaissance in Florence, when Leon Battista Berti and others tried to codify the symbolic form of the modern perspective. The attempt was precisely to introduce a new form. This is actually the, how you render a 3D space on a two-dimensional space, or like what Panofsky once probably said, the modern perspective was the introduction of, was the depiction of the infinite in a limited space. The same way today, I guess we have to face a sort of epistemic revolution or an evolutionary perspective in the way we try to enter the abstract space of data center and data space. But indeed today we talked a lot about philosophical concept. We had a pretty philosophical approach, but my presentation will try to actually focalize and focus on three historical case studies. And in this way, try to analyze historically what is the norm of power is basically the same question of Foucault that Foucault had. What is the norm of power? The norm of power, the form of power is for me probably the attempt to find a mediation between the universal and the particular. The form, the norm, the social norm, the political norm is indeed the way historically it emerged, this incarnation of a universal concept in a more particular regional context and vice versa. The social norm, the political norm is this space of friction, of also political friction, of social tension between universal ideas and more particular context. So just to give you briefly, you saw some picture. I will try to extract and follow the evolution of this form, of this norm, through this topology of data, how the information, how data, we didn't have the notion of data probably in the modern age. We didn't have even the notion of information. Try to follow how design, knowledge of the world transformed in more codified science and grow up in complexity. But let's start with some historical references from actually the history of statistics in Germany. It was in his 1978 course, Security, Territory, and Population, Michel Foucault pointed out that specifically in the modern age, the knowledge of the state developed as a knowledge of things rather than knowledge of the law, stressing that the science of the state, or statistics, also had a numerical foundation. In statistics, Foucault aimed to discover a mathematics of the state distinct from the mathematics of capital that is traditionally the concern of political economy and Marxism, we may say. According to his sources, the discipline was born in the small German states of the 18th century, out of their fierce competition. And the word statistic itself was invented by jurist and economist Gottfried Hackenwald in 1749. So the need to collect information on the territory and population breathed a new generation of apparatuses, which shortly became military assets. The civil knowledge that was gathered about population, national economy, and infrastructures could become easily the target of the enemy's military intelligence. There was then the need to protect collective data as arcana imperi, as the Roman Empire called the secrets of power, that held a strategic advantage against the enemy. What is interesting for me in Foucault's genealogy of statistics is the relation between power and large numbers, the genetic tension, the growth of mathematical apparatuses out of power crisis. Slower? Oh, well. I guess they have the text. Is it slower? It's okay. They say it's okay. Is the speed okay? The speed is okay. No, they have already a translation. We have English-German translation ready, so I guess I can get, I should go slower for everybody, not just for the translation. But I don't read here. Do you have any good light for? We do like this, maybe. Let's see some. Okay, no, let's say, in Foucault, for me, I said, it's interesting this relation between power and large numbers that he managed to detect. The genetic tension, the growth of mathematical apparatuses out of power crisis, geopolitical tension, and wars in general. Afterwards, the modern apparatuses of statistics will be instrumental in the management of genocide, as also the collaboration between IBM and the Nazi state demonstrates. Still, one should never forget that the mathematics of human classification was already operative during the Atlantic slave trade, and this is from this book. This is a publication titled "Stowage of the British Slave Ship Brooks Under the Slave Trade" from 1788. And it's already in this form of design. You see this cruel computation of human body, of slaves. Foucault did not, however, record the merging of the institutions of number with the technologies of number after World War II. The assemblage of institutional statistics with numerical databases marked the birth of a normative power that Foucault, but not his colleagues, Gilles Deleuze and Félix Guattari and many other French philosophers, failed to recognize. So the long wave of North American cybernetics will cross the Atlantic and reach philosophers such as Raymond Rouyer, Gilbert Simondon, even Jacques Lacan, Deleuze and Guattari, and many others, but not Foucault, who remained faithful to a modernist idea of power based on the technical assemblage of institutions with knowledge apparatuses, but not with knowledge technologies. So this is important for me. Foucault had an incredible interest, and he made an incredible research on modern statistics, but strangely not on the technologies of number. So the development of these numerical apparatuses in relation to power happens recursively at each historical and technological turn, yet always establishing new symbolic forms and scales of power. This is also recorded by the historian James Benninger in his book Control Revolution, that shows how the information revolution actually was triggered by the industrial surplus of the United States after Second World War. But today, the information overflow that started in that period, in that kind of economic growth, today the information overflow of the global networks of communication and logistics is opening up new landscape of data that require new technique and perspective. So the recent amplification and transformation of the old matrix of Western power has produced new complex topology that we have to study. And this is, I guess, important when we discuss also what is the form of power and how universalism is challenged by the new technologies and norms of power. So what is the symbolic form of the techniques of control and power based on data mining and machine learning algorithms today? Some history of technology, some archaeology is necessary here to illustrate the transformation of the numerical grid of ancient registers, similar to this, in the digital matrix of complex databases. Since the late 70s, that is, since the information revolution, For instance, the notion of pattern recognition, how you recognize something in a chaotic set of data, how you recognize a meaningful string in almost random numbers. Pattern recognition has slowly emerged as the new computational norm of power that has expanded, in some cases replaced, the old institutional norm. So pattern recognition evolved from the primitive, pre-digital data records of the 70s into, for instance, the non-relational topological space of the late 2010. The study of the symbolic forms of computation in relation to power and also capital is a necessary step toward envisioning adequate forms of counter-power and counter-computation, maybe. This is just, a general presentation about this, my idea that indeed this computational norm is replacing the institutional norm. So if in the modern age the institutional norm was indeed the norm of mental health, social behavior decided by institutions, maybe even the discipline of science and medicine, today you have form of norms, you have norms, you have social norms, even norms of good behavior, psychological health, they are computed. They are like precisely described through, and they emerge through computation. And I will go through, as I wrote in my abstract, through three case studies. The first one is this system developed by the New York Police Department called CompStat already in the 80s. Then through the analysis of Skynet, this is an NSA system for data collection, mainly operative in war area like the border between Pakistan and Afghanistan. And the third case is IAS. This is a company sponsored by the Defense Department of the United States to make topological data analysis. But yeah, we start indeed from the urban grid. We start from the very material example. Still, you can recognize something here. This is something that comes from the New York Police Department, and it's pretty difficult to find also online. And it's very endearing because it's an attempt of a digital grid of a portion of New York, Manhattan. You can maybe recognize Harlem from some name of the street that was made with a typewriter. So it was the attempt to digitalize the map of New York, not via computer, but via typewriter, and to introduce a kind of codified system to, as you can see, to record petty crimes. So it was the attempt to a sort of a very primitive predictive policy algorithm made without a computer of any sort, following the broken window theory. And so the most sophisticated algorithms, like today the algorithm used by a police department in the United States and in Europe, are often of modest origins. Good media archaeology should always ask what kind of material, procedures, a new technology comes to replace, expand, and amplify, and also what new troubles it introduces. Predictive algorithms are increasingly implemented by the police department of large metropolises to predict future crimes, but they are rooted in tools for crime record visualization that were pioneered in the US and Europe in the 70s. How do predictive policing algorithms work? Basically, they use 3 data points in the easiest description you find. These algorithms are described according to 3 vectors, 3 data points: past, type of crime, place, and time. And a unique algorithm is try to extract a pattern from this basic data. So, for instance, this company called Predpol developed a software that provides each law enforcement agency with customized crime predictions for place and time that crimes, to understand in which part of the town a future crime most likely is going to happen. I mean, it's a very basic idea. It's like, indeed, as I said before, inspired by the broken window model. They collect data, and according to the past data, they try to guess a future crime, and trying precisely to guess in which part of the matrix, of the grid, of the urban map, this crime is about to happen. Predictive policy algorithms so expand and make more computable the idea behind the CompStat system that was developed by the New York Police Department well before the internet age. And I will just mention this briefly. This CompStat system that is still in operation in New York, it was developed by a guy, a policeman called Jack Maple. In the late 80s, Jack Maple was a cave cop of the New York Transit Police, where the cave means basically the New York subway, is a nickname of the New York subway. At the time, was still considered a dangerous place. Bored with his routine, Maple had the idea to start plotting crime records on a big map of the city, basically also an idea very similar to this few years after. On a 55 feet of wall space, he mapped every train station in New York and every train. Maple explained that then he used cranions to make every violent crime, robbery, and grand larceny that occurred. He started to map the resolved case from the solved case from the unresolved case. And then Maple started to ask the 76 police precincts to compile crime statistics daily and to fax this data at the time with a computer to the headquarters of the New York Police Department. Then Mapp said in an interview, you map everything, then you can start looking at patterns and chronic condition. And that was probably the first time, I guess, the term pattern emerged in criminology in this way as an attempt to predict future crimes. So it's interesting for me how this shift from information to pattern recognition already was taking place in the mind of a New York cop in the 80s. As other people described, Maple had put in place a system of computerized, up-to-date crime statistics that provide commanders with a clear picture of day-to-day crime patterns. The police convene weekly meetings for top commanders to review crime statistics with their precinct colleagues in an effort to determine response patterns. Maps were important from early on. The new data allowed commanders to visualize where crimes were occurring and, crucially, whether arrest patterns match crime patterns. So by the end of 1994, we are talking about the 90s, New York City crime records declined by 12%. And they said that the reason was precisely the implementation of this CompStat method. But a similar experiment in crime record visualization was mentioned also by, for instance, by Paul Virilio in his book Speed Politics in the 70s, and was something called Criminostat. There's something called like that in France. So it's interesting for me how already between Paris and New York, this idea of pattern police was emerging in the 70s, and was for me already a way to describe this, to enter this abstract space of data in a time that is well before the internet age. So for me, it's remarkable how Maple developed this method well before the digital age, just expanding the broken windows theory and figuring patterns out of criminal behaviors. Maple gave his system the visionary innate charts of the future, but it was soon turned into the more bureaucratic CompStat, short for computer statistic or comparative statistics. In the matrix of CompStat, human beings, streets, and blocks become the cellular automata of an algorithm of power. Deleuze would identify this as modulation, this form of power as modulation of flows rather than discipline of body in his famous postscript on the society of control that probably you know very well. But the critique of this predictive algorithm used in police is still in its infancy today. So it's interesting for me how to go back to that period and just to bring maybe an example of how or what they look like at that time. So this is just a bit of archaeology to show how indeed the form of this social normativity was starting to have a computational destiny in that time. Now I would like to maybe to move to more recent things and to this pattern of life analysis system used by the US Army. I tell you the story that has been repeated by many journals, like what happened, for instance, the 12th of December 2013, just before the sunset, near the town of Radda in Yemen. A convoy is driving to a wedding celebration when suddenly a mosquito-like buzz is heard in the sky before every car is incinerated by 4 missiles fired by US drone, killing 12 innocent civilians. The Nation reports the US has bombed at least 8 wedding parties since 2001. That is, since the beginning of the so-called War on Terror. These targets happen to be blindly selected by statistical algorithms that are often pompously labeled artificial intelligence, only because they found similarities between the patterns of life of this wedding celebration and the movement of known terrorists. This is like an error, of course, in the algorithm. These attacks are called signature strikes because they are ordered without knowing the identity of a designated target, only on the basis of signature of metadata that the targets leave on communication networks in terms of patterns of life. That is, movement from one point to the other, network of contact, and usage of mobile phone, as you see in this slide. This is a slide leaked, this is an NSA presentation that has been leaked, I don't know, in 2015, and you find it on the website, The Intercept. This is an example of how also the new forms of power, they are no longer interested basically in knowing the identity. They're just basically interested to track collective behavior and compare collective behavior. This, as you can see, probably you can recognize actually also in this map Abbottabad, where Osama bin Laden is there, is killed. And this is like just a slide showing the tracking show the tracking of movements of a potential target that we will see in the next slide. This system is called Skynet. I was saying, by comparing the patterns of life of millions of civilians, because this system actually is like recording the metadata of all the phone communication of that area. By comparing the patterns of life of millions of civilians with those of known terrorists, this algorithm attempts to guess the unknown ones. Tragically, the digital footprint left by wedding parties matched those of previous meetings of insurgents. Innocent deaths are here the result of a miscomputation. As the former director of NSA, Michael Hayden, cruelly summarized, today we kill people based on metadata. Skynet is the name of this classified NSA project to collect metadata and only metadata from millions of phone conversations within a large region or zone, such as the border between Afghanistan and Pakistan here. The algorithm computes metadata alone as a way to scale down gigantic data set. And interestingly, it works regardless of the language spoken and more importantly of any encryption you can use. So you can even encrypt your communication, but this is not what the algorithm is interested. It's just interested to find correlation between your metadata and somebody else's metadata. There is, and by metadata, sorry, we refer to something like a description of a phone call, like for instance, the time of the call, the length of the call, the number that are calling each other, and all these other descriptors that precisely are not the content of the call itself. Indeed, there is no time to analyze messages word by word, especially in a foreign language, or to run decryption software for like days to try to decrypt the meaning. The system of metadata-based and activity-based analysis concentrates on what people are doing rather than on what they are saying. It is important to stress that the patterns of life signature emerges regardless of the message content and the identity of the messengers. Metadata absolutely tells you everything about somebody's life. If you have enough metadata, you don't really need content. It's embarrassing how predictable we are as human beings, confess NSA General Counsel Stuart Baker. So this is the description of Skynet made by The Intercept in 2015. Skynet engages in mass surveillance of Pakistan's mobile phone network and then uses a machine learning algorithm on the cellular network metadata of 55 million people to try and rate each person's likelihood of being a terrorist. Somewhere between 2,000 and 4,000 people have been killed by drone strike in Pakistan since 2004, and most of them were classified by the US government as extremists. So it seems that this algorithm has been behind the military decision taken to kill 4,000 people. In the years that have followed, thousands of innocent people in Pakistan may have been mislabeled as terrorists by that scientifically unsound algorithm, possibly resulting in their untimely demise. So today we have an extensive literature devoted to the drone war as an apparatus, but not much to the drone brain, to the techniques of data analytics and machine intelligence that direct the drone to its target. The patterns of life that are computed by machine learning algorithms are an example of the computational norm that comes to expand traditional military techniques and their normative power. Perhaps in any disciplinary power, the subject is always constructed in absentia, but these enemies are assembled via digital footprints and made of pure individuals. The enemy of the West emerged here as a clumsy mathematical construct. As Paul Virilio prophetically remarked in the case of the French system Criminostat, in a world of pervasive computation and forecasting, the confession of the crime would be no longer necessary. I don't know if you got the idea of the construction of the target in these slides, but this slide is precisely showing how there is a recording of a pattern of life, behavior, social network, and connection, and then the pattern is like compared with pattern of known terrorists to guess who can be a new potential target. In some cases, for instance, this is a mistake of the algorithm because, of course, journalists in the same region, they have sometimes the same movement and behavior, only 5 minutes left, of insurgent and other military personnel. So this is an example how the algorithm picked up as a potential target journalists of Al Jazeera. But yeah, we can also scale up and look for, because as you can see, starting from the New York police, we are still, this was a very basic grid and data analysis of the urban space. Still, this is an hybrid space between, the virtual abstract space of phone communication and the landscape. But then we can scale up, and there are systems today of data analysis that are completely almost separated from the real space. And I have only 5 minutes, so I don't know what I can do, but I move quickly through the most complex example. This is IASDI. IASDI is a company funded, not sponsored by DARPA, the Defense Advanced Research Project of United States. And is an attempt to develop a system of data analysis for any form of data set, database in the world. What they introduce is like what is called topological data analysis. And for me, it's interesting because they turn numbers into shapes. They turn numbers into space. So this, for our architect, is a great example because indeed, the only way to browse, to understand this data set, to find an interface for the human brain is to introduce this spatial dimension. But what is interesting for me, that's like topological data analysis is the transformation of a numerical matrix into spatial dimension, but in order to unveil hidden relation intuitively. If CompStat, the system of the New York police, records crime along urban coordinates and Skynet detects pattern of life across large communication networks, IASDI attempts to universalize pattern recognition and anomaly detection for any kind of data set. In machine learning, there is an important distinction between supervised and unsupervised learning. from systems that precisely they have to look for something that is already known, and systems that have to look for something, for patterns that are not known at all. Under the eye of this system, of this machine learning algorithm, the world is going to look different. An important application for the analysis of data set is in a hospital and medical laboratories, for instance. Machine learning algorithms can find correlation between cancer genomes and life expectancy. Topological data analysis appears to be universally applicable. To popularize its service, IASD has revealed 13 new basketball positions against the known 5 and presented the result to Barack Obama last year. In the future, such topological construct will be as familiar as the net performed in the 90s. And it's also the way our subjectivity and also our position in the grid of society will be described. And this is also the way, for instance, Google, Facebook, the giants of the digital capital, they see society, flows of behavior, flow of consumption, and so on. It's the way precisely social trends are like detected and detected and forecasted. So, yeah? Okay, then, okay. I went through the difficult case, but so I just read the conclusion. In the evolution of these matrices of control and production, surplus value extraction and social norm enforcement eventually come to be computed through the same technical form. It is data analysis. This is part of the also idea, the form of power and the form of capital are united that become universal through computation. The mathematics of power and the mathematics of capital finally superimpose themselves on the same datascape and become translatable into one another. Planetary computation has granted companies, such Google, whose power is greater than traditional states, and the post-Westphalian orders include the virtual territories of global data centers. The border of Western imperialism appeared to extend vertically along this datascape that are owned only by corporations mostly based in North California and also in China, but we don't know much about those in China. Unsupervised machine learning carries the computation of power and capital into unknown territories. Power and capital emerge there as a higher form of intelligence that is able to perceive correlation and opportunities that are not accessible to the human mind, therefore introducing a cognitive divide that is deeper than any digital divide. Machine intelligence inaugurates an alien domain of power of which drone warfare, for instance, is just a peripheral territory. The introduction of the topological perspective to large data set is the birth of a symbolic form that, as I said before, is comparable only to the birth of modern perspective in Florence during the early Renaissance, at the time thanks to the introduction of Arab technique of optical projection using astronomy, as Hans Belting has reminded in one of his books. At that time, the compass that was used to follow the stars was turned downwards and pointed toward the urban horizon. A further dimension and depth was added to portraits and fresco, and in this way, a new vision of the collective space was inaugurated. It was a revolutionary event of the aesthetic kind, yet charged with political consequences. Similarly, a yet more abstract perspective of the world is initiated today by global data centers and the mathematicians of the datascape. If inaccessible data centers that precisely contain this picture of the world, vaguely, and the mathematics of machine learning constitute the new secrets of power, how can we confront them? In a prophetic passage of Schizoanalytic Cartographies, a book by Félix Guattari dated 1989, published the same year of the Berlin Wall fell, Guattari framed Western history according to 3 stages of deterritorialization, in his view: European Christianity, capitalism, and the age of planetary computerization. That in his opinion would be able to bring also a creative and new form of subjectivization for humankind. Guattari did not perceive digitalization as a threat to the human. He wrote, with temporality put to work by microprocessors, enormous quantities of data and problems can be processed in minuscule periods of time in such a way that the new machinic subjectivities keep on jumping ahead of the challenges and stakes with which they are confronted. Recently, cultural anthropologist Diane Nelson has shown the potentiality of ethnomathematics specifically in her documentation of the Guatemalan genocide around 1981-1983. She reminded everyone of the macabre etymology of algebra, from the Arabic al-jabr, bone setting, the reunion of broken parts of a body, of the two skeletons that have been recomposed on each side of the equation. Numbers are for many peoples the medium of colonization, but Nelson holds that numbers are deeply entangled in both violence and amazement, oppression and emancipation. She tells us that the mathematics of the people against the mathematics of governments is possible, and indeed there are still many struggles to count for her. So, more and more alternative techniques of data mining are being explored today by an emerging data activism that fights for social justice, human rights, and equal access to education and welfare. But what if data analytics and topology, like this case, actually manage to unveil a superior social dimension that is intrinsic in any piece of information and that has been intangible and inaccessible until now? What if these techniques of data visualization and navigation finally gave an empirical form to a modern concept of collective agency, which have been abstract and invisible to individual eyes so far? Deleuze, and I conclude here, described the logic unit of power in the age of computation as the individual, the power embodied by data banks, would be no longer interested in targeting a specific subject, but only modulating pre-individual and collective patterns. If we focus only on the deconstruction of the individual into data, we miss its political reconstruction and assemblage as collective data, as co-individual. Data and metadata can be considered the individuals that are used to compose new subject or co-individuals, whose coordinates are transversal to all subjectivities and open to new combinatories. So the idea is precisely that this new matrix of power that can be used by power, but that can be also by us. It's also a way you can see, is the point of view, is the perspective through which you see this matrix. I guess forensic architecture probably is the best example of how this algorithmic complexity and algorithmic tool can be reversed in their use, and how the military algorithm, they can become tool also for activism and human rights research. So you can see the computational norm from two sides. From the point of view of power, it is the problem of an abnormal behavior to modulate. And from the point of view of a collective intelligence, it could be the birth of a new ultra-normal behavior, or the mark of a super social new form of life. Thank you.